Who do you need to trade for, and who is it time to get off your roster right now? We'll go over all of that in this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. Each week, I'm going to give you some recommendations, try to maximize the overall value of your starting lineup. Sometimes these will be recommendations for immediate value, and other times it'll be getting guys on your roster that I think could help you down the stretch. As a reminder, you can click the link below to get my full article, which will have all of my trade recommendations for the week. We'll start with the bad news and go over my sells for the week. And as always, I'm going to differentiate between players that I'm trying to straight up trade and other players that I'm just trying to explore the market on to see if I can get value for where they're at right now. We're going to start with the player I'm just trying to get off my roster right now, and it's Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver Christian Kirk. Now, Kirk has not really produced over the last couple of weeks, so I don't know what you can get for him in the trade market. However, he did have some hype coming into the season, and he has shown flashes of being a really solid fantasy wide receiver in the past, so you might be able to get value for him based on fantasy managers in your league seeing his perceived upside. However, I think Brian Thomas is the clear wide receiver number one in Jacksonville right now. And with Evan Ingram now coming back from injury, there are a lot of options in this passing attack and possibly too many options for how bad the Jaguars offense has looked so far this year. Kirk saw just a 17% target share in week 6 on just 20% of the team's air yards. He has now played on under 80% of snaps in 2 straight weeks, and that's with Gabe Davis also managing an injury of his own. Even though I think Gabe Davis is the clear fourth wide receiver or fourth receiving target in this offense, 4 receiving targets in an offense with how bad Trevor Lawrence is playing is not something that I can really get behind. Christian Kirk is going to have some solid weeks, and he may have a solid week this week against the Patriots. So possibly you want to hold on to him and then try to trade him after this week, but I think he's going to be too inconsistent to trust in fantasy lineups, and so I'm looking to trade him away right now with the emergence of Brian Thomas and the return of Evan Ingram. The other type of sell is when we run a process on a player, which is when we explore the market to see if we can get a good return on a player based on where his value is at right now. And so this week, the player I'm running a process on is Pittsburgh Steelers running back Najee Harris. Now, my colleague Pat Doherty said that if you call up somebody in your league and ask them if they are interested in Najee Harris, they may tell you to lose their number. And that's entirely possible because we have seen Najee Harris as an inefficient runner over the past. However, there are a lot of teams right now hurting at running back with the injuries, and so somebody may be interested in Harris because he's coming off a game where he racked up 122 total yards and a touchdown. We know the Steelers want to run the ball, so there is some perceived security in Najee Harris's role and his volume, and that could entice some people. However, I don't really love his actual snap share that we're seeing right now. Jaylen Warren came back this week, and even though he wasn't 100% healthy, Najee Harris played on just 48% of the snaps. He took 48% of the rushes, and he saw his route participation rate fall to just 36%, and that's, again, with Jaylen Warren not 100% healthy. You're going to see that route participation rate drop even further as Jaylen Warren gets more involved in the passing game. Justin Fields is going to continue to get his rushes. So we're looking at a situation where Najee Harris could see between 12 and 16 touches most weeks for the Steelers. And to me, we have just seen Harris not be efficient enough to make the most out of those touches. So I'm trying to see what I could get for him in fantasy trades right now. You might be good in your running back situation, and you could offer Harris for an upside wide receiver 3 target like Jameson Williams, which the Fantasy Life Trade Analyzer says is a pretty fair trade, but a trade that favors the fantasy manager getting Jameson Williams. So that could be an option for you. I also like the idea, if you're sitting pretty, maybe you're 4-2 or 5-1 in your league, you could trade Najee Harris to the fantasy manager who has somebody like Puka Nacua. Now, the Fantasy Life Trade Analyzer will tell you that is a value for the player getting Najee Harris, but that's just because Nacua might be out for another 2 weeks. If you are in good position and you could add Nacua to your team and get him for the second half of the fantasy season, that could be a trade that the manager who has him really needs to make if they need to win right now. So I'd be exploring trade options for Najee Harris. Now, before I get to my buys for the week, please pause this video, comment below, let me know which players you're trying to trade for or trade away, or ask me any fantasy questions, and I'll get to those as the week goes on. Like with our sells, we're going to have 2 types of buys here, and the first one is when we buy a call on a player, which is when we try to buy a low-cost share of a player who hasn't really emerged yet, but we think is going to have an increase in fantasy value in the future weeks. And so this week, I'm suggesting buying a call on Tennessee Titans wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins. The suggestion to buy on DeAndre Hopkins is to try to get him for next to nothing in hopes of future production. Now, DeAndre Hopkins was listed for me as one of the most likely receivers to be traded at the NFL trade deadline. The other possibility for an increase in production is because, well, he's DeAndre Hopkins. He's also finally starting to get healthy after spraining his MCL in July. DeAndre Hopkins saw the most route participation that he's had so far this season in Week 6. He has been either tied for or the highest target earner on the Titans for the last 3 weeks in a row. And I know the Titans are not a great offense. They're going to play from behind a lot, and they are going to pass the ball. So there's a chance that Hopkins is getting 4 or 5 catches for 50 or 60 yards a week. And if he gets into the end zone, that's a pretty solid fantasy day. And that's if he sticks with the Titans. What if he gets traded to the Chiefs or the Saints or the Bills? And that could boost his fantasy value. And right now you can get DeAndre Hopkins for next to nothing, stash him on your bench, and then hope to see some return in the weeks ahead. And that will really help your fantasy production for the final weeks of the season. The last buy recommendation of the week is to buy low on Denver Broncos running back Javonte Williams. Now look, I understand that buying any part of the Denver Broncos offense right now is not something that is entirely appealing. However, I think that Javonte Williams' role is growing to a point where he could have some value for you if you're really struggling with running back injuries right now. In last week's loss to the Chargers, Javonte Williams had just 23 rushing yards on 6 carries and 13 receiving yards on 3 receptions. So the person who has Javonte Williams right now might be looking to get rid of him, might still think that he's not really doing anything. However, if you look at what happened with Javonte Williams' usage last week, he had a 68% snap share, and perhaps more importantly, the Broncos kept him on the field in passing situations, and he had a 63% route participation. That's really good considering the Broncos are likely going to be trailing a lot. So Williams is getting on the field in run-heavy situations, and he's getting on the field when they're behind now. And so I'm not suggesting he's going to become a league winner, but that type of role makes him a low-end RB2, and I think you could get him for really nobody right now. Keep him on your bench, add him to kind of your running back depth. He can be a bye-week filler, he can be an injury filler, and maybe he's just going to get you 8, 9, 10, 11 points, but that's something that could still win you a matchup if you're really struggling at running back. So I like trying to see if you can get a no-cost share of Javonte Williams in your leagues right now. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. As a reminder, you can click the link below to get the full article with all of my trade recommendations. You can click below to like and subscribe to get this video and all of our fantasy football and football content over at NBC Sports for the remainder of the season. And I'll see you next week. Happy trading.